Hi, I'm Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 164 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. Today, we're going to be talking about something really cool. This is the remake of the A4091 SCSI controller. Now, the original A4091 SCSI-2 controller came out a little while after the Amiga 4000 to address some complaints from people about the fact that the Amiga 4000 came with IDE instead of SCSI like the Amiga 3000. Most of us considered the SCSI edition, the Amiga 3000, a positive thing, and we saw only the IDE, which is slower and less versatile. We're like, that seems like a step backwards. The IDE on the Amiga 4000 is fine. I mean, it's okay, but it has some limitations. First of all, it's only a two-channel interface, allowing you to use only two devices at a time, maybe two hard drives or a hard drive and a CD-ROM. If you want to use four devices, you have to get some kind of 4X IDE device like the one I reviewed right here a few months ago. Second, it was fairly slow as the Amigas only supported PIO0, not the faster implementations that were becoming available in the early to mid-90s. Now, PIO0 was rated at about 3.3 megabytes per second, which is honestly fairly quick for an early to mid-90s machine. A lot of the clones that you would buy back in the day were not even that fast, but you could spend a lot of money and get a faster machine. Newer implementations, at the time the Amiga 4000 came out, could handle PIO2 with some other different machines, which was up to 8.3 megabytes per second. Later variations like PIO3, PIO4, the DMA and Ultra DMA, they were years down the pipeline. They weren't even implemented yet. The third thing is that IDE uses a fair amount of our precious CPU cycles when it's transferring data, where SCSI leaves those CPU cycles alone, does it on its own, saving more space for multitasking. So SCSI solves a lot of the problems that the IDE that the Amiga 4000 had. One of them, and it solves them because the A4091 was a DMA compatible Zorro 3 device. There were only two of them made. There was the A4091, and then there was the Fastlane Z3 from Phase 5. Now, I happen to own one. I use one in my Amiga 3000. The Phase 5 card is really nice, the Fastlane, because not only does it have fast SCSI, but it also has the capability of handling up to 64 megabytes of RAM natively, or even 256 megabytes of RAM with a special mod that you could add to it and actually use like 16 megabyte 30-pin SIMs in there. Really uncommon at the time, and those SIMs were super expensive. Mine has 64 megs. The SCSI doesn't work properly in my Amiga 3000, as it often doesn't, and so I use the onboard SCSI of the Amiga 3000. Now, the A4091 can theoretically support up to 10 megabytes per second, but you'll never achieve those speeds, ever. I'll get into the specifics in a minute, but the IDE on the Amiga 4000 can usually hit about 2.5 to 2.8 megabytes per second, which is good. And then with the A4091 and my ZuluSCSI, we can hit between 4.8 and about 5.5 megabytes per second. And you're not going to see performance much faster than that. I mean, this little guy's got a 68060 in it, and it still taps out at 5.5 megabytes per second. The best performance I've seen with SCSI on any Amiga is with my Warp engine card, which is fantastic. I've got an 060 module on there that converts the 040 to the 060, 128 megs of RAM, and it's got fast SCSI too, but it interfaces with a CPU socket, not Zorro 3, and I'm easily able to get 7 to 8 megabytes per second out of that little guy. Unfortunately, it's not working right now. The other benefit of SCSI is the ability to daisy chain up to 7 devices to it instead of the 2 or 4 with IDE. CD-ROMs, tape drives, scanners, and more. There's all kinds of things you could hook up with SCSI. You could add all kinds of these new devices that you couldn't necessarily do with IDE. One of the things about SCSI that can be tricky sometimes is termination. If you don't terminate your SCSI chain properly with either a physical terminator like the one that was kindly included with my board. You'll probably have to order that separately. SCSI Terminator. Or using the onboard termination of the A4091 or an external terminator if you're using external devices. SCSI is very, very picky about its termination. And if you've used SCSI at all for more than just plugging in a single hard drive and going, you've run into these issues where something's not terminated and nothing works. And if you have used SCSI a lot and you say you have not run into these termination problems, you're a big fat liar. Now, Commodore had the card out, the A4091 card out for a while, and then DKB, which is a really awesome Amiga company, took over the licensing and distribution and assembly of them. I'm not quite sure why, maybe it was a financial thing, but they sold the A4091 card for a while. But it's long been out of production. But will we Amigans let a little thing like, you know, companies going out of business affect us from moving forward? Nay, nay. Our friends Stefan Reinhaur, sorry Stefan, and Chris Hooper, or Chris Hooper, maybe I should use that with an accent too, just kidding Chris, decided to create a ReAmiga version of the A4091, allowing the Amiga 4000 and some A3000s to purchase and use a brand spanking new A4091 card. Let's take a look at some of the stuff. Now, first of all, just take a look at the implementation of this shipping box. This is about as authentic as you're gonna get. It's even got all the details on the side there. This is sweet. And everything comes packed really nicely. It's got a nice little cushy squishy in there. Mine happened to come with that little terminator that I showed you. Now mine also came with a printed book that we're going to take a look at in a few minutes. But this is like a genuine Amiga book right here, the later generation Amiga books that most of us have in our inventories. Now, while you can use the original A4091 ROM in your unit, it's better that you use the new custom ROMs that they've created. They've added features that are kind of important, like the TD64 and NSD64 protocols, which basically lets you use drives bigger than 4 gigabytes in the system. So you can put a 50 or 100 or a 250 gigabyte hard drive in here, no issues at all. Or with the original A4091, you're probably limited to 4 gig partitions on your hard drive. Now remember, we talk about the Amiga only supporting 4 gigabyte partitions in the early 90s. Poor us, we're stuck with 4 gigabytes. But think back and remember that Windows machines were stuck with 2 gigabyte partitions. And that was it. You're done after 2 gigabyte partitions up until like Windows 95 came out. Now maybe there were some hacks and some tricks and some special hardware to use bigger hard drives, but that wasn't common, that wasn't standard. Where we were singing 4 gigabyte all day long, we didn't care because we're awesome. Now, in order to use this brilliant device on your Amiga 4000 or Amiga 3000, you've got to have a Buster 11. Now, the first generation of Amiga 4000s and most of the A3000s are going to have Buster 9 on the Amiga 4000 and then like a Buster 7 on the Amiga 3000. You're going to want to upgrade those if you've got one of the lower versions. It just doesn't work, or just doesn't work well with a Buster 9. There are still some sources out there to pick up Buster 11s, and our friend Dave Haney and Jens Schoenfeld from Individual Computers are supposedly working on a new Buster called the Buster 13 that may be out in another year or two, that addresses some bugs with the Buster, makes things more compatible, makes DMA work better. I don't think it's going to run any faster, but in theory that'll be out in another year or so. Now, using it on the Amiga 3000 is another story indeed, because in theory it should work as long as you have a Buster 11 in there. The Amiga 3000 does have 03, but it's not quite the same implementation. It's kind of the first generation of it, and it can be a bit buggy. Now, I've tried it in my ReAmiga 3000. I plugged the little thing into my Amiga 3000. I put my SD card from my SCSI to SD, from my ZuluSCSI that I had been using in my Amiga 3000 with the onboard controller. I moved that to the A4091, and it corrupted the card just like that. Boom, killed the card, destroyed every bit of data on it. Now, probably a fluke. I could probably put another card in there and it would be just fine, but that got me a little nervous about it. So we've seen the box and we've seen a little picture of the board. Let's take a look at the real board and see what's on this little guy. Come on. Here we go. Let's take a look at this little beauty here. We've got some nice custom gals from the original Amiga A4091 card. This is the ROM right here, and you can either use the onboard or the standard A4091 ROM, which has some limitations, or the enhanced ROM. I recommend the enhanced. And we've got the SCSI controller chip right there. What do we have? LSI. Okay. You've got a header here if you need to get power to your SCSI device. Mine has a particular little mini one right here. See, it's got both the mini header and the standard Molex type connector, which is cool. Now, it also has the ability to mount a hard drive right on the card. Mine has a special little ZuluSCSI on here. This is the compact ZuluSCSI, and I've got a story to tell you about this. We've got the internal 50-pin SCSI adapter, and let's take a look at the back real quick. Around back, we have a SCSI-2 interface, and we have some dip switches, which we're going to take a peek at here in just a second. Now, the cool thing about the SCSI interfaces is if we need to adapt this to a different kind, like if you need to go to a 50-pin Centronics type with pins on it, there's adapters, man. It'll adapt this SCSI to that SCSI to the other SCSI, and it all works fine. You can adapt this to a SCSI 3 type cable. Works just fine. It's going to work at SCSI 2 speeds. Works fine though. Let's take a look at what those dip switches would do, and take a look at the beautiful manual. Just look at this lovely manual that they have included with mine. I mean, this is the real card stock that they used for the original manuals, and it literally has everything in it. All the Commodore licenses and information. Pretty cool. How to install the motherboard. Then we've got some dip switches where you can change your SCSI ID here with the dip switches in the back. Change from a fast SCSI bus to a slow SCSI bus to handle some really old devices if you got something old you want to hook up to it. Short and long spin up, which was important for some of the early SCSI drives. If you remember those, you'd turn them on and they'd start, and eventually it sounded like a flippin' airplane taking off, and they would take like 30 seconds to spin up. But with modern devices, you don't need that. This one's important. Synchronous mode, you want to be turned on in most cases. Synchronous mode is faster. And external SCSI termination, you want to switch that if you are using some external devices, and then you can use a little pluggity plug on the back of your external devices to terminate. And logical unit numbers, changing your SCSI addresses. It's got all the information on that. Installing hard drive on the board. How to do your little SCSI cables, which is really cool. Internal SCSI devices, external SCSI devices. This is a really, really, really well-made manual. I'm impressed. Now, when it comes to using SCSI inside, a lot of us are just going to have just one internal device like this, but many of us are going to want additional SCSI devices. Like I might want to replace my IDE CD-ROM with a nice SCSI CD-ROM. So you'd think, like in the Amiga 3000, you just kind of have to lay the cables neatly over the back plane here. But look what they did on the Amiga 4000. Take out these two screws. This little back plane comes off. Look at, they've got it notched out right here. You can just run your SCSI cables right through there to make it super easy. And you just put this right back on top of it, and your SCSI cables are not getting in the way. That's a really cool feature, and I have not thought about that feature in years. Now, while we're getting it powered up, let's talk about the way that I used to use my Amiga 4000 versus the way I'm using it right now. Now, I have been using this machine with IDE, and I would use an actual SATA SSD drive. This is just a standard 120 gig SATA SSD drive. I've got a cool little adapter that converts SATA over to IDE. It only works at PIO speed, so you're not going to get any real speed improvements. It's just quiet. I've got a review of that little interface here, and I've got a review of the 4X IDE interface I use with it for my IDE CD-ROM that's in there. Now this reliably gives me about 2.5 megabytes per second. There's a cool utility called DevTest that's included with the A4091 card that'll test these hard drive speeds. And here's a graphic of what I tested when I was still using it with my SSD card. You can see the performance is fine. 2.5 megabytes per second pretty consistently. It's pretty good. But remember, IDE also uses a lot more CPU cycles in its processing, so slows her down a little bit. So this is a ZuluSCSI. I did a review on the ZuluSCSI right here. And the ZuluSCSI, the way it works in a nutshell, is you've got a drive, an SD card, formatted in exFAT format, which allows for file sizes bigger than 4 gigabytes, okay? You format that in Windows. You create these hard drive files, which are just basically files that represent like an entire hard drive. And I go over how to create those in my ZuluSCSI video. I encourage you to watch that if you don't know what I'm talking about. So what I did is I took my 120 gig SSD and I created a nice big fat 120 gigabyte hard drive file. Took that on my exFAT formatted 128 gig SD card, threw it on there, booted it up in WinUAE, worked like a champ, sees it, works perfect. I thought, okay, it's going to be great. I stick this in my A4091 and I boot my Amiga. I'm thinking, that's not booting. That's just going up to a kickstart screen. Why is that? It's not seeing it. It was acting like it would see the SD card because it wasn't flashing an error light on the ZuluSCSI or anything. Oh, what's happening? So I booted to an install floppy, an Amiga OS 3.2 install floppy, came up fine. Didn't see the hard drive, didn't see the partition that I created, the big 120 gig partition. I divided it up into a 4 gig workbench and 116 gig data, I think it was. No, 250 some odd gig partitions. Didn't see it. Thought that's odd. I thought, you know, I'm going to launch HD Toolbox and just see what's up here. So, of course, the A4091 card does not use SCSI.device as its controller. It uses A4091.device. You see that right down there as its controller. So I change in my HD Toolbox on my install disk. I go into the information. I change device equals A4091.device. Launch it. It sees a 128 gig SD card, but it shows it as, you know, not partitioned, not even recognized. This is weird. Told it to read the drive definitions. 128 gig SD card, see it's just fine, but not formatted exFAT. It's like it's not formatted. So I think, okay, it sees it. I'm going to go in and create some partitions. Although I didn't think that I could. This is a ZuluSCSI, not a SCSI to SD. It looks at hard drive files. It doesn't look at the actual SD card and allow you to create partitions on that, does it? No. So I went in and I created partitions on the 128 gig card, thinking, that's not how ZuluSCSI works at all. I've never seen anywhere that it can work like that. But I did. I created a 4 gig and I created 2 like 50 plus gig partitions. I formatted them. Okay. They formatted fine. I rebooted, and this time I put my SSD drive back in, my IDE SSD drive, booted up to that just fine. I could still see the partitions on the ZuluSCSI. Again, I shouldn't be able to, but I did. Copied the data over to them. Thing booted just beautifully with a 128 gig card, partitioned like it was a SCSI to SD, not a ZuluSCSI. I thought, I'm going crazy here. So I got in touch with Alex Perez from Rabbit Hole Computing. He is the guy that distributes 99% of these ZuluSCSIs. I'll have his link in the description, but this is where we get our SCSI to SDs. This is where we get our ZuluSCSIs. Fantastic guy. I talked to him. He said, yeah, if it doesn't quite see the card right, it will go back into this like default mode where it will act more like a SCSI to SD. He says it's kind of not really supported. It kind of doesn't work really well, and there's more of a chance of data corruption, more overhead in the system. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try it for a couple days. Worked perfect. I'm transferring data back and forth. I'm creating partitions. I'm moving things from... Worked fine, just like a SCSI to SD. I had no idea they work like that. But I didn't keep it like that. Instead, I formatted one of my 64 gig cards, created 2 hard drive files on there, smaller ones, and then moved the files over to that, so it's working the way ZuluSCSI is supposed to. Works exactly the same. Same speed, same performance, same overhead. Huh, who knew? So let's take a closer look at the performance. Come along. Now just look at this lovely picture from David Wright that I use in my background. This is from, I think, Amiga Art Contest like 2021, I think it is. Fantastic artwork. So, of course, when you're dealing with a hard drive controller, you want to look at things in HD Toolbox. And if we go up here to information, you'll see here I've changed SCSI device equals A4091.device so it can see that device just fine. If I wanted to see anything on my IDE channels, I could just add another line in there telling it to also search SCSI device. It has no issues reading more than one of them, but I just kept it one at a time. It sees 2 of my drives here, HD01.HDA, HD0.HDA, and HD1.HDA. You see I created those in UAE, so it's kind of telling me there, that's fine. And they work just like regular hard drives. It sees it as a 4 gigabyte partition. I always keep my primary partition 4 gigs or below for compatibility with some funky software. Always keep your file block size larger when you're dealing with these larger drives. With 4 gig, I generally go with 4096. You can see what I have for my mask and my max transfer. Those I looked up. And then when we deal with the bigger ones, we want to go with like this is a big drive here. Like this drive, there's a 27 gig and a 27 gig partition. So what I used are 32K blocks. Maybe I could get away fine with 16K, but I've got the memory for it, so we're good. Sysinfo is one way to take a peek at hard drive performance. Its hard drive checks are not particularly accurate because what they do is they look at the speed of the interface and less the actual speed of the hard drive. And so we're going to take a look. And I find especially when I scan the workbench partition on any system and I do a speed test, it'll come out, it'll just kind of tell me the maximum speed between the interface and the computer. And then it stops at 6.5 megs per second. It never tells you any higher than that because sysinfo. But when I scan one of my other drives, like ADH1, then it will sometimes give me different results. It'll say like 5.7 megabytes per second instead of 6.5. Not the most accurate thing in the world, but it gives you an idea what's going on here. But what the developers did is they included this really cool program we're going to take a look at here. Let's make sure we can see it okay. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. This program is called DevTest. Now I've already put it on my system. We can look at the options here. Benchmark device performance, test specific device driver, do a destructive operation with a write operation, etc. We're just going to do a regular dev test. So we could do dev test -b, the name of the device, which is A4091.device, and then the drive number. In this case, it's drive 0. So I'm testing basically my partition that has my workbench on it. And it does the test, and it's 5.4 megabytes per second, 5.2 megabytes per second, 4.7 megabytes per second. It shows it in kilobytes per second. But you can see from the picture that I showed you before of my onboard SCSI, this is easily twice as fast as the onboard IDE, and even faster because it frees up a bunch of CPU time. It doesn't use a bunch of CPU time while it's doing its work. That works pretty good. The other nice test is drive test. That runs and it takes about 15-20 minutes to run, and it gives you some pretty accurate counts too. The counts are about the same. About the max I see in there is like maybe 5.7 megabytes per second. Let's take a look at a real world operation here. Now, I've got 116 megs in my computer. I'm going to go to my data drive, docs, and videos, and we're going to take a look at the videos I have in here. I've got some 75 megabyte videos, 176 megabyte, 130 megabyte. Let's look at this 28 megabyte video right here, Mario Versus. Okay, I'm going to take it, I'm going to copy it to RAM. We're going to see how long it takes. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. About 9 seconds to copy a 28 megabyte file from the hard drive over to RAM. That's pretty darn quick. That's a pretty zippy little system right there. When you launch programs, that's pretty fast. You know, basic programs like TextEdit, they come up instantaneously. Even programs like Eyebrows are pretty darn quick when they launch because they're launching right from the hard drive. I mean, that's pretty darn good performance right there, launching Eyebrows. Now let me show you one of the advantages of using SCSI over IDE. Here's a nice big fat 74 megabyte file. That's going to take a few seconds to copy. We're going to copy that over to RAM, and while it's copying to RAM, I'm going to go ahead and launch Eyebrows. You see it launches just fine because it's not using an absolute ton of CPU time. And we're going to launch Art Department Professional. All the while it's copying over a 78 meg file over to RAM. The darn computer is running just fine. You're not having any big slowdowns or anything like that while it's copying the file over because it's not using a bunch of your CPU time. Pretty cool, huh? Load up a nice image, still copying over the 78 meg file. Ha, we just filled up the RAM drive because Art Department Professional uses an absolute ton of RAM. That was a bad choice. But you get my point. You can continue to use your system while your hard drive is chugging away, and it runs at fairly close to full speed because it's not chewing up a bunch of CPU cycles. Here's another cool little thing. So reboot your Amiga. Hold down the right mouse button during reboot. Normally if you hold down the two mice button, Mises button, it'll boot up into the early startup menu. Hold down the right one with the A4091 card and you get into the A4091 early startup. Here's a cool picture of the card here. Isn't that neat? Click on disks, tell you which drives are installed here, how big they are. ZuluSCSI, nifty. Dip switches, it'll give you an idea of how your dip switches are set, and I would assume that it actually shows the actual physical configuration of the dip switches. Click on About. Thank you to Dave Haney, Scott Schaefer, Greg Berlin, Terry Fisher for the A4091. Driver based on NetBSD, Amiga SCSI subsystem, blah, 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 blah. Only Amiga makes it possible. Absolutely true. Debug, Zorro 3 Magic Speed Hack. I can't select it because you know I would if I could and see what the heck that does. But it also has a CD-ROM boot option there. So that's actually really cool that it has this early startup menu. So let's talk about all of the other machines from the early 90s who could use hardware to create a virtual startup menu using context-sensitive mouse button. Let's see, there was the Amiga, and oh, it's the only one that could do it. Only Amiga makes it possible. Now you're never going to get the full 10 megabytes per second that the A4091 is theoretically capable of. Now the Zorro 3 is what limits it really. Zorro 3 is awesome. Love you, Dave Haney. We're so glad you invented it. The theoretical maximum speed of Zorro 3 is a whopping 150 megabytes per second. Ain't never going to see that with any device, because of the limitations of the Buster chip. 13.5 megabytes per second is really the maximum you're going to see with current implementations. Now Zorro 2 is about 3.5 megabytes per second, so it's, you know, an order of magnitude faster. You add in the limitations of the OS and the drivers, it slows down a bit more. So 5.5, maybe 6 megabytes per second if you're lucky. Like if you hold your Amiga at an angle and all the bits are going downhill, gravity will make the bits travel faster. Maybe you'll get 6 megabytes per second. Trust me, try it. It works. Now, the reason I can get better performance out of the Warp engine that I mentioned before is because that little guy is right on the CPU bus, the CPU expansion bus, and it bypasses the Zorro limitations, and it can hit the hardware even faster. So I was easily getting 7 or 8 megabytes per second out of that. Now, why aren't I using it? Because it died. It just quit working about 3 or 4 months ago, and I got to send it in and see if I can get it fixed, because I love my Warp engine. It is the sweetest card. Now, one thing you're going to want to do to get the maximum performance is to make sure that your ROM is moved up into 32-bit RAM. That's a little bit faster. Sometimes your accelerator will have a little program that allows you to move the ROM. If you're using some kind of, well, you can't use a Vampire and Amiga 4000, so never mind. But if you're using just a regular accelerator or just an A3640, MMU Libs has a program called MU Fast ROM that will just move the vectors of the ROM into 32-bit RAM and repoint everything there. And it causes a reboot when you first start the Amiga, and then it puts it in ROM. You get about a 5%, 7%, 10% speed increase with any hard drive interface, built-in IDE, SCSI, whatever. It just increases performance just a little bit. Now, what am I going to do with my A4091 card? I'm going to keep it right here in my Amiga 4000. At least I'll get my Warp engine back. Then I have other plans. The performance is fantastic. And while I do lose a Zorro slot, which is sad, it's worth the sacrifice. I'm trying to decide whether I'm going to keep the IDE CD-ROM in there, because it's a pretty good one, or if I'm going to switch over to one of my SCSI CD-ROMs. I may do that. I may also stick 1 or 2 high-capacity IDE devices. Maybe that 120 gig SSD drive. Maybe I'll stick a compact flash solution in there that will just allow me to have huge amounts of storage in here. Maybe I'll get 300, 400, 500 gigabytes of storage in here, which is quite a lot. I might hook up a nice SCSI scanner. I might put on one of my SciQuest 44 megabyte removable drives, those big old honky clonky things. I got 2 of those. I may put one on there. I'm going to have fun with it. And what if you want one of these devices? Can you just stop over into Kmart or something like that and pick it up in aisle 7? Nope. There's a couple ways. First of all, you can make one yourself on the GitHub, which I'll have in the description. There's all the thingamajigs and the doodads required to assemble it. They're all listed right there. You can order the actual raw board itself. I think PCBWay has that. And then you have to just solder the what's it to the who's it, and then realign the thingamabob and burn a new WYSIWYG, and you are just off and running. You built your own. Or you can do like I did and be put on a list and buy one pre-assembled because your soldering skills absolutely suck. That's what I did. I will have a link to where you can put an order in for one in the description. So what's my final opinion? Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely love it. The guys that created are some of the nicest guys on earth. The guy that built mine is absolutely one of the most fantastic guys on earth. Bless you, my friend. I really appreciate it. Performance improvements are worth it. It works great with the ZuluSCSI devices. I'm sure it'll work great with SCSI to SD. It'd probably work great with a version 6. You'd get nice 5 megabytes, 6 megabyte per second out of it. Just don't assume it'll work with your Amiga 3000. Just don't make an assumption that it's just magically going to work, because your 3000 probably doesn't have a Buster 11, and even if it has one, you know, you're going to roll the dice. There's the dice, roll the dice. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Who knows? Now, Dave, like I mentioned, Dave Haney and Jens Schoenfeld, are supposed to be working on a Buster 13 chip. Maybe that will solve all of our problems on the Amiga 3000 and the Amiga 4000. I don't know. That'd be awesome. Huge thanks to my wonderful patrons who are scrolling over this incredible image from Amiga Art Contest 2023. At this time, there's still a couple of days to get your contributions into Amiga Art Contest. The date is November 11th that you need to be submitted by. And if you'd like to help this channel, pop on over to patreon.com/10mark for more information. Thanks, everybody. I truly appreciate it. Thanks for joining me today. I really do appreciate it. Please like and subscribe. It helps more people see this video. And I want to get up to 1 million viewers by the end of the year. I'm at like 7,030 now. So there's only like, 993,000 new subscribers that I want to get between here and December 31st. So see if you can help me out with that. We'll see what we can do. Follow me on all the social medias, Facebooks, Twitters, everything like that. Links are in the description. But until next time, I'm Doug. This is 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast, and I'm signing out. See, tricked you with a new one, didn't I?